Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 22nd of August, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Thank you for spending part of your morning with us. Robert, good morning to you as well. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway to breaking as of this morning. Was he national security advisor for a while under the first Trump administration, John Bolton. His D.C. home was raided. Apparently, maybe they're looking for classified documents. What's the latest?
Good morning, Mike. That's correct. It was early this morning, and it was announced and exclusively to the New York Post, and they said that a senior U.S. official said that this investigation into Bolton involving potentially classified materials began in 2020 and was shut down by the Biden administration. This official said for political reasons. In 2020, the Trump administration launched an investigation into Bolton after he published his book that they claimed used national security secrets.
Mm-hmm. Is this going to end with John Bolton? You said the Biden administration shut it down over political reasons, obviously because John Bolton is a thorn in the side of Trump. I do wonder if this is going to end at Bolton and not end somewhere else.
I'm not sure who they would go after next. I think this could be the first step to going after former Trump officials who, especially ones who work in the national security realm, who published tell-all books after the 2020 election.
All right. Thanks. And some shocking news yesterday. I didn't realize this. I don't think anybody realized this. Apparently there's 55 million visa holders in the United States. And I saw there's a lot of reaction, and it ranged from disbelief that there's just 55 million visa holders in the United States. But then also people talk about the housing shortage. And the question is, do we really have a housing shortage, or are there just a lot of people in the United States who probably should not be here? Legal under visas and also illegal. Hopefully this problem gets sorted out. But what's the latest on these 55 million visa holders?
Yes, it is quite a high number. The State Department said yesterday they're going to be conducting a continuous review of these 55 million foreign visa holders. And they're looking for potential indicators of visa overstays, criminal activity, or support for terrorist organizations, or even terrorist activity. In addition to this announcement, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he's also implementing a total pause on worker visas for commercial truck drivers after that high-profile crash that ended in fatalities here in Florida last week.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sure seems like we're probably looking at thousands of visa cancellations, because you go back to these pro-Palestine protests during the campus occupations over the past couple of years. Many of them are students. Many of them were chanting things like pro-Intifada and death to the American empire, and just, generally anti-American and pro-violence sentiment. It sure seems to me like they are going to get P&G'd for persona non grata from this country. So stand by. Maybe more protests over that as well. All right, and then also oil theft. Robert, you've talked about this a couple of last year sometime maybe. Oil theft in Texas, and there's an entire FBI task force for the Permian Basin, and all they do is look into these oil theft rings. So what's the latest?
Rep. Tony Gonzalez, who is a Texas Republican, he said he's reintroducing what's called the Protect the Permian Act. And this would increase criminal penalties for stealing, transporting, or selling any stolen oil or oil field related equipment. And this bill would also fully fund that FBI task force. It's the Permian Basin Oil Theft Task Force. When I looked up the numbers for oil theft in the Permian Basin, the Texas Independent Producers and Royalty Owners Association, they said they estimate that the oil theft in the Permian, in West Texas and the Permian Basin, is at billions of dollars annually. And last year we did cover a West Texas law enforcement bulletin talking about this, where it seemed like during the Biden administration that a lot of the oil theft didn't just increase, but also seemed to have involved more violent crime related to the oil theft, including threats and assaults on oil employees.
Mm-hmm. You know where oil theft is really bad? All across Mexico. I would not be at all surprised to see that this is predominantly Mexicans and cartels involved in these oil theft rings. That's pretty much just standard practice down there. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, there was that case where these guys went out, they drilled a hole in one of these Mexican gas pipelines, and people were just bringing like bowls and buckets and plastic bags, filling up gasoline And I don't know if some guy lit a cigarette or lit a match, or if there was a spark or something like that. It ignited. It killed like over 100 people, like instantly vaporized from this explosion. Pretty gnarly. At any rate, luckily that has not happened. Well, maybe somewhat unluckily, maybe I don't know. That has not happened in the United States. All right, listen, Robert, go ahead and take it away. Finish out the Sitrep items here, starting with Alligator Alcatraz.
So yesterday, a federal district court judge in Miami ordered Florida and federal officials to close or to wind down operations at the Alligator Alcatraz immigration detention facility here in the Florida Everglades. The judge also ordered officials to begin removing all of the infrastructure installed at the camp within 60 days. The Florida government said that they are going to appeal this, so I expect this to continue through the courts over the next couple of months. Democrat state officials in at least a dozen states sent letters to 18 asset managers. This includes BlackRock and State Street, and they're urging these asset managers to continue using their proxy votes to push companies to adopt environment, social, and governance policies or ESG policies. And one of these state officials is the New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, who was involved in a confrontation with ICE a couple of months ago that we reported on, and he instructed asset managers like BlackRock to submit plans to the city outlining how they're going to work with companies to, quote, invest in decarbonization operations or risk losing access to New York City pension funds. As we've covered before, ESG, their origins include an attempt to redefine fiduciary duty, and the idea is driving fossil fuel companies out of business. In BlackRock's case, this was actually through potentially illegal pressure on CEOs, and they have a lot of these asset managers have taken major hits in the courts and in the media lately. And I think what's going on here is Democrats are trying to get these asset managers back on the political objective of decarbonization, threatening to pull out their own state pension funds as red states have done over the last few years, because in the case of BlackRock, they got involved in that Panama Canal conflict on the side of the Trump administration. And I think they're trying to get them back in line. And then S&P Global data released yesterday showed that the S&P's Purchasing Manager Index rose by 3.5% to 53.3, and this is the largest increase since May of 2022. And the S&P Global Market Intelligence, they said that this is due to a strong increase in demand for U.S. manufacturing, and actually the strongest since 2022. And this has also led to an increase in manufacturing employment in the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is the PPI, the Purchasing Producers Purchasing Index, a measure of inflation, one of them.
No, this is the Purchasing Managers Index. This is based on the amount of orders that factories have received.
Okay, gotcha. All right, thanks for that, Robert. And let's move on to our global Sitrep, starting with Jared. I'll let you take it away from this Allied Defense Architecture update.
Yep, there's a lot of little things that happen. All together, they make a nice little picture. So the Japanese are moving upgraded anti-ship missiles to Kumamoto by March of 2026. That's the giant red circle here in the center of the map. It'll allow them basically to provide anti-ship missile coverage to most of China's northern fleet and a lot of their eastern fleet as well. The Philippines finished a visual inspection of the Abukuma class destroyer, which we covered back in July, at the very beginning of July, that Japan is going to sell them. That will actually significantly upgrade the Philippines' overall surface combat capabilities and strengthen the coalition forces. And then Australia, Canada, the Philippines, and the U.S. they've all run numerous small exercises and operations over the last week, including maritime patrol operations up in the Strait of Luzon. It's all pointing towards the same thing, getting better at interoperability. Now, moving on, the State Department issued sanctions on 2 more China-based crude oil and petroleum products terminals and storage operatives yesterday. This is per the State Department, part of the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. The Treasury Department also sanctioned 1 individual and all of his companies for facilitating Iranian petroleum trade. Then, moving much closer to home, over in Peru, Peru exported almost $1 billion worth of gold to China in just the first half of 2025. It was $947 million. Now, in comparison, for all of 2024, they only sent $885 million worth of gold. Now, given those are in dollars, I could not find them in weight. So there is some price inflation to go along with that. However, it still points to a significant jump in Peruvian gold heading toward China. And China overall has been buying gold throughout the year. Anyway, they reported 12.8 tons of total purchase in just the first quarter of 2025. They're still stacking. And moving across the border over to Colombia. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, in response to the U.S. naval forces we covered earlier this week deploying to the Caribbean, said that a U.S. invasion, quote, would transform Venezuela into another Syria, which would drag Colombia into a regional conflict. He did not say which side he would be on in that conflict. That said, I think it's probably defending Colombia's borders due to instability. I don't think it's taking part against the United States, but he did leave that ambiguous. Petro
sure,
claims
if you're Colombia, you're very concerned, as they have been for many years now, very concerned with refugees from Venezuela spilling over the border.
Absolutely. Petro claims he offered President Trump personally a multinational effort to fight drug trafficking without compromising anybody's sovereignty. And the Venezuelan president actually issued another call last night encouraging all Venezuelans, including Army reservists, to enlist in the state militia in order to combat imperialism.
And that's in response to this. What was it? Is it a carrier strike group or a destroyer? What's been moved down off the coast of Venezuela?
There's a ton of stuff down there. So we've got 3 destroyers in the area that are going to be near Venezuelan waters. There's a littoral combat ship that's already in the area conducting the same mission, but not reported to be going over that way. And the Iwo Jima Strike Group, which is an LHD, an LPD, and 2 LPDs, which are the LHD has a flat deck. It's kind of like a smaller carrier, and the other ones are much closer amphibious landers carrying 2,200 Marines. Those are all going down right near Venezuela to conduct drug interdiction operations. And that doesn't even account for all the stuff that's in Panama right now that could also be used for the same thing if Maduro did decide to get a little froggy.
Okay, so this is effectively a counter drug, counter narco blockade of Venezuela.
In effect, yes. But it's not just targeting Venezuela. It's all interdiction. That's really the crux of this, is stop drug flow into the United States. Mm-hmm. And whoever's affected by that, well, you shouldn't have been sending drugs.
Yeah. Whenever we talk about drugs from Colombia, Venezuela, wherever they're coming from, there's that really great show on Netflix called Narcos. And in that, one of the DEA agents is down in Bogota, Colombia, and he's talking with his counterpart there, basically saying, this is the drug problem in America is Colombia's fault. If you didn't start sending cocaine to the United States, we wouldn't have this problem. And the Colombian counterpart looked at him and said, if American demand for drugs weren't insatiable, we would not have a cartel problem. And I think that's kind of the heart of the matter here. Put the onus on domestic demand. On that topic, anytime the flow of drugs gets disrupted, there's price fluctuations. And when things are in the same level of demand but lower supply, you have prices go up. I do wonder at what point this may cause an increased amount of violence in the United States, because if these drug dealers don't have enough drugs to go around, I don't know. A question maybe for another time. Certainly someone with experience in that. So thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on. Listen, at this point, just an announcement to everyone. Starting on Tuesday, September 2nd, we're going to go back to the old Sitrep and early warning format. So we will be briefing all of our Sitrep items, getting you caught up on major developments at home and around the world. And then when we go into greater detail, especially about the future, we start looking at trend lines and talking about what we think is going to happen in the future. The early warning segments, that will be moved over to the high side on the Forward Observer website for members only, just as a quick announcement. I will continue to talk about that. All right, coming up this weekend, well within the baseline, 400 protests this weekend. This is next weekend is going to be the big one on September 1st, Monday. It's going to be the big Labor Day protest, the next national day of action. All right, with that, let's go ahead and talk about this popular support myth. So last year I got into a debate with this professor about this concept of popular support. You've probably heard that before, probably in context of insurgency or counterinsurgency. This is the concept that a revolutionary or insurgent movement needs the active support or passive support from a substantial portion of the populace in order to succeed. And they do. They do need that support in order to succeed. That is undeniable. This concept of popular support is crucial. And I'm going to talk about in just a minute why this is important for us domestically. It's important to understand because an insurgent organization or a revolutionary movement gets most of what it needs from the people. We're talking about intelligence. Everyone is a sensor. They can pass up information about police movements or military movements or things that they hear or see. They get support from manpower because all their manpower is drawn from the people. They get support through logistics and transportation and all the other auxiliary functions. And so it stands to reason that the more people you have backing an insurgent organization or a revolutionary movement, the greater access to intelligence, manpower, logistics, etc., that organization is going to have. And that is 100% true. But where this understanding becomes vague is the threshold of popular. What is popular? What is the threshold of support and popular support? It does not mean that a majority of the population supports an insurgency or revolution. History is pretty clear, although it is situationally dependent, that insurgent organizations become sustainable after achieving support from just 15 to 30% of the populace. These insurgencies are often local or regional. And so if they have 15 to 30% of the local populace supporting them at the local level or regional level, or in some cases national level, they're viable and sustainable. That is a substantial minority of the population. That's far away from 51%, but that does constitute popular support. That is enough to say that this movement has popular support. More than anything, that active or passive support, because we're dealing with two different kinds of support here. Active support means you're actively providing assistance or cooperating with an insurgent organization. Passive support is supporting them maybe occasionally, but generally supporting them through moral support or providing them legitimacy. This concept of legitimacy is extremely important for any movement, an organization, insurgent organization or revolutionary movement. Because when you have support, you gain legitimacy, and also importantly, you deny legitimacy in support for the authorities, which is in most cases going to be the government. This is the true strength of the people when we talk about people power. And typically this is also going to be the center of gravity, or at least one of the major centers of gravity for the insurgency. In Afghanistan, we had this saying, I guess you could say Iraq too, as the people go, so goes the war. And it's true. If Afghans had overwhelmingly supported the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and denied their support to the Taliban, they would be living under democracy today. But they didn't do that, and so they're not. As the people go, so goes the war. And I'll explain why this is important also here domestically in just a minute. There's a parallel to popular support, and that is acquiescence. In the case of the Taliban and literally every other insurgent organization on earth, what they lack in popular support, they can kind of make up for in the indifference of the people. If the people are indifferent towards insurgent organizations and they also don't support the government, that's almost as good as having their support, because acquiescence creates space for insurgents to operate. It means villagers are not reporting or informing the authorities of insurgent activity. It means, in many cases, freedom of movement. No one's trying to interdict or no one's trying to get in the way of these insurgents because the villagers just acquiesce. They're indifferent. So they will stay out of the way. They can probably be coerced by insurgents into some level of occasional support as well. And this matters domestically. I think everyone should be familiar, maybe not everyone. If you're interested in this stuff, you should be familiar with this guy on your screen, Brigadier General Samuel Griffith, peace be upon him. He was one of the guys that wrote a really great translation of a bunch of Mao's work, Mao Zedong. And one of the things that he found through his study of insurgency, that's where he came up with the 15 to 30%. When an insurgent organization has support from just 15 to 30% of the population, historically they're viable, sustainable. So why this matters here is there is this misunderstanding of the concept of popular support for this anti-Trump resistance. And in previous days, I've written and also discussed, actually for a few months now, discussed this process that's going to take us from 2025 to 2028, and that is protest to resistance to revolution. That's the three phases of what we are going to see. Well, we're at least going to see the first two phases. We're in protest now. Resistance is going to ramp up at some point in the future. And then revolution, I think, is open-ended. That's the part that they don't talk about, obviously. But depending on how the 2028 election goes, if it's contested, or if it's close, or if it's legitimate, or if it's illegitimate, or there's some credible claim of voter fraud or whatever, then we're going to see a color revolution take place in this country if it doesn't go their way. So popular support for this color revolution movement does not mean that they need 51% of Americans to oppose the Trump administration and support the opposition in order for them to win. And if it's not the Trump administration, it's going to be whatever Republican who gets elected, however he gets elected, it's going to be the next one, the Trump successor. What this means is that they probably have a third of the country actively supporting them, or actively or passively supporting them. I think there's probably another third that's pretty indifferent. And then another third that opposes them, that's on the pro-Trump side. That is enough to support and sustain their movement. That is not only going to enable them to be politically relevant, but also remain within striking distance of political victories like the 2026 midterms. That is the next big picture challenge here in this low intensity conflict. Remember, this is about legitimacy. Elections, the popular perception of free and fair elections confers legitimacy. So with 1/3 of the population on the anti-Trump resistance side, they're going to be able to generate the resources and the energy and also the legitimacy that they need to keep pressure on the 6 key pillars. This is fundamental to this color revolution strategy. Talked about it. It's over on the Ford Observer website as well for members. Talk about the 6 key pillars, what they are, why they're important. It's going to enable them to shape narratives, especially as long as they have support from mainstream media. And then also, it's going to enable them to contest the authority of the administration. That's what all the sanctuary laws and not providing support to the Trump administration, in some cases, actively trying to block whatever they do through the courts. That is trying to contest the authority of the Trump administration every opportunity they can. So as long as they keep that level of support and the center maintains their relative indifference, we're looking at an organized resistance movement that is almost certainly going to last for years. At this point, it could probably last indefinitely as long as they have that base of support. This is why movements that appear to be in the minority on paper can still wield outsized influence. You know, I see a lot of people, primarily on social media, say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of blue-haired boomers out at these protests, and they don't have any staying power, and that, et cetera, et cetera." Basically saying this could never happen. That's not my perspective at all. You look at who attends these protests, and yes, of course, they're predominantly boomers, probably to the tune of 75% or maybe more, depending on where you are. But that's just a visible manifestation of the broader movement, and there are younger people in the movement. So protest is a form of activism that is popular among boomers. It's going back to the 60s. That's pretty much all not all they've known, but that's just been their primary MO. Point being, that's still a sizable portion. That's still at least 15 to 30% support for this protest resistance revolution movement. this all boils down to legitimacy. And in contested environments, this is not an absolute number. It's relative to the strength and the cohesion of the opposition. There's a really great quote, and I think it's from Randall Carlson, that says, typically when we look at these types of environments, the side that wins is the most cohesive. And so the quote's a little more eloquent than that. I apologize that I can't remember it. It's a great quote. The point is, the more cohesive side in these environments typically wins, or the best organized and most cohesive. And so I look at the level of organization on the left, on the anti-Trump resistance, compared to the level of organization on the right or the pro-Trump side. And I think that you have to consider that in terms of, at a strategic level, who has the strategic advantage there. I think the left is the anti-Trump resistance is far more organized than the pro-Trump side. And so, historically, if you're looking at a side, the side that wins is typically the one that's best organized or better organized, in the side that has the better cohesion. And, that's extremely important. A movement's power comes from its internal cohesion. If you look at military, for instance, you look at the British in India, the British Army was much smaller, but they had far superior internal cohesion. They followed orders because that was part of their discipline, and that's part of their training. And that's why you have the British Army in India consistently defeating these larger Indian forces. They did that because the source of their actual power was their internal cohesion. It's like a rock or a balled up fist. If you punch somebody with a weak, loose fist, it's a slap. But if you ball your fist up and you have really solid internal cohesion for your group, you're going to be able to punch above your weight. And this is exactly what this is about. So that's why solidarity is such an important concept on the left, having internal solidarity with everyone in the movement. Okay, so point being, this is fundamentally universally true in every form of low-intensity conflict all around the world, and it's also true in the political struggle here at home. So whether you're talking about an insurgency or this left-wing protest, resistance, revolution model that I've described, the lesson here is that successful movements do not need an absolute majority to sustain themselves, nor do they need an absolute majority to win. As long as that movement does not lose support, they can endure. And as long as they're enduring, they're working towards shifting that political center of gravity in this country to their favor. And that's what they're trying to do, especially through this outreach and organizing effort that's been going on. I mean, you've seen all the campaigns. There's No Kings, and there's Hands Off, and there's Tesla Takedown, and there's Mayday Strong, and there's about to be Labor Day coming up next weekend. This is what they are doing. All these campaigns are aimed at growing the base, at getting more phone numbers, getting more emails, getting more online contacts, getting more face-to-face contacts, physically going to these meetings and integrating them into this broader movement. This movement is building effectively an army for the midterms. They're going to be focused on getting out the vote. And if you just think about this, if every single person, if just one person, if every single person in this movement brings one person to vote, they double their voter turnout. That's going to carry Democrats into a House majority in the midterms. I'll just reiterate, after the 2026 midterms, we're looking at escalation either way. Because on one side, if Democrats retake the House majority, this movement is going to have a lot of legitimacy. Their actions are going to be more legitimate because now they're working, it's this inside-outside strategy. You have people on the inside, the federal workforce, the civil service, Congress, working on the courts, working on the inside to wear down the Trump administration. And then you have the social power on this outside. You have the protest to resistance to revolutionary movement also working against the Trump administration on these pressure campaigns, eroding the 6 key pillars of support for the Trump administration. And their strategy is and will be Once you erode those 6 pillars of support, this building's going to collapse in on itself. That's the strategy they're going for. That's why they're going all in, obviously, on the midterms. But, guys, I'm telling you, after next year's midterms, we are going to see escalation in this country, at least surpassing what we saw in 2017. This could obviously happen before. If Republicans maintain a House majority, especially if they do that through this mid-decade redistricting plan, this left-wing movement is going to have their narrative. The House majority was stolen. This is no longer a democracy. This is the beginnings of a dictatorship. They're trying to build that urgency, build that narrative, and have mass turnout. And that could start, obviously, before the midterms, but it will definitely happen after the midterms. What everyone needs to keep in mind is that this battle right now is primarily psychological. The battle is about reducing support for your adversary and your adversary's cause while increasing the support for yourself and your cause. And the side that can do that, which is to say the side that can increase its own legitimacy at the expense of the opposition, is the side that's going to win. That is the chief task for both sides. Voter turnout in the midterms and control of the House is going to be decisive for this phase 2, where we move from protests to organized resistance. It's going to be disruptive. It's going to happen all across the country. And I don't think either side, I know there's a tendency, and I just bring this up, I know there's a tendency to look at the Democrat Party and say they're unpopular and they're disorganized and they can't even agree what a woman is. How are they going to win a conflict? Which is a fair point. But remember, it's the internal cohesion. It's the internal solidarity that is typically the decisive factor in who wins and who loses. And that's what it comes down to. So really, you have to ask yourself, is it, and we could talk about left versus right. We could talk about Democrats versus Republicans, conservatives versus progressives, capitalists versus socialists, whatever you want to do. But you've got to ask yourself, which side has the higher internal solidarity, which is to say, probably going to have the highest level of legitimacy to carry them through. So I think that's a fundamental question, something I'm trying to answer. So I hope that's interesting, and I hope that kind of spells out what I think is going to happen over the next 3 years, roughly, and some things to start considering, especially when you start looking at your local level. Which side of this conflict, when you look at your area, even people in, say you're like 60, 70, 80% red county or red district, which side has the highest level of internal solidarity and cohesion? That's really what matters. That's what you have to be building for yourself here. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to gerrymander watch. Robert, what's the latest here? California looks like they've passed this new bill.
Correct. They passed all 3 bills yesterday, and that's first, the new map. Second, the constitutional amendment allowing them to potentially implement this new map, and then a bill calling for an election on the 4th of November. And Governor Gavin Newsom signed these 3 bills yesterday. And when he signed them, he said he hopes that California's mid-decade redistricting inspires Democrats in other states to start their own redistricting efforts in earnest. I think that, as we've said since the beginning of this, the major problem for blue states is that many of them are already heavily partisan gerrymandered and don't really have a lot of room to move on this. However, Republican states do have quite a few seats they could pick up, and I think that probably starting next week, I expect to see more movement from some states other than Texas on getting these new mid-decade maps going.
Mm-hmm. All right, so what is this? Is California now adopting this new redistricting plan for the midterms? They still have to pass a referendum. What do they have to do now? What's next?
They still have to get through this special election on the 4th of November, where there will be a statewide vote to allow basically them to use this map. And if it fails, then they will not be able to legally at least implement this new map.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that update. As the world turns, let's move on to this Cobalt stockpile that the DoD is announcing.
Yeah, this is from the Defense Logistics Agency, and they're attempting to build a cobalt stockpile for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And the DoD began selling off its cobalt stockpile in 1990 until it was effectively depleted. And they are trying to purchase 7,500 tons of cobalt over the next 5 years, according to some contract documents that they published this week. This is an important metal. It's not just used in batteries, but also it's a key alloy material for munitions, aircraft parts, especially superheated metal alloys used for jets and jet engines. And it's also used in electronic warfare and radar equipment. But this is only the latest of a series of purchase orders that have been posted in roughly the last month by the Defense Logistics Agency for critical metals. And this includes a slew of critical metals that we rely on China for. So I think this is likely at least partly in anticipation of this pivot to China containment that the Trump administration has been pushing for since the beginning of the year. And they're expecting that key imports of these key defense production materials would be cut off, which also means this is part of that larger Fortress America strategy, with the idea of creating a buffer for U.S. industry, U.S. industrial production, especially defense industry, and the U.S. economy from any kind of fallout from a conflict or crisis with China or a decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is over the next 5 years. So we're not talking about trying to get all this stuff done before 2027, which is the Davidson window, which is kind of the one possible window for the United States and China potentially going to war over Taiwan. All right, so obviously this is an early warning indicator of at least some reasonable expectation that global trade is going to be disrupted, and we obviously don't want to run out of these materials. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's move on here to this latest out of the ongoing kind of skirmishes here between China and the Philippines. What's going on, Jared?
Yeah, I would hold off on skirmishes just yet. We may find out that this one turns into one. It kind of looks like it will, sort of. Anyhow, the Philippines is reporting a large Chinese force composed of 5 Coast Guard ships, 9 militia vessels, an unmanned aerial vehicle, a PLA Navy helicopter, but no associated boat, and 11 armed, this is actually a new development for them, armed rigid-hulled inflatable boats or RIBs. Now, those RIBs, they typically don't have crew-served weapons. Here they all did. That's a new development. They all converged on the second Thomas Shoal. I think it was Wednesday night, and they've been there so far. There has been no direct activity aside from placing a barrier, but the Philippines is on standby at their Sierra Madre outpost that's right there. It's in the second Thomas Shoal. It's a grounded naval vessel that we gave them, and they grounded it back in 1999. And the armed forces of the Philippines said that their military is ready with contingency measures in case anything really starts to happen there. I will be frank and upfront here. I do not expect this to escalate into lethality. I simply don't. There has not been a case of it happening. We have not even seen a true severe injury since last year, around, if I remember right, it was around July. That said, this last week appears to have established a new baseline of activity, with the Philippine military constantly being prepared for lethal defense and the Chinese constantly increasing their aggression and presence around the South China Sea. The reason for that is China's trying to save face. That collision really hurt them. They did not like that. And they successively have failed to save face, to rebuild their face after that. Now, the Sierra Madre has been a sticking point with them for decades. Like I said, the Philippines grounded in 1999, and they claim the Philippines must remove it because it's on Chinese territory. Debatable. The greatest threat here is that the Chinese force that's assembled will attempt to remove the Sierra Madre, or at least make it impossible to man the outpost. They do technically have the ability, with the force compiled, to make it impossible to man or resupply. That would cause a significant incident, and the Sierra Madre has stepped up its patrols around itself to prevent the Chinese from getting too close. So everybody is already kind of in heightened tensions, preparing for what could be the worst. I, again, do not think it will escalate to that point. I don't have a reason to think it's going to go beyond simple posturing.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jared, we see all these ships lined up. The only time I see boats lined up like that is in the middle of a redneck booze cruise. Is there any reason why there's They're all stacked up on each other like that.
Well, so if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me say that China's military it's always posting marching videos and propaganda and never performance. So like if you look at the US military, whenever you see what the US military puts out, it's always somebody performing an action that's related to combat. It's very clearly training. The Chinese military almost never does. It is always performative. So I think they think that is training, and that's what you're seeing here. And on top of that, keep in mind a good half of this is the militia vessels. These are not professional military. They are just basically Chinese citizens that agreed to perform some armed functions. So that's probably the bulk of what you're seeing there is the militia lining up. Not a great tactic, but is what it is. That said, they did not stay lined up. They definitely moved in, spread out, performed plenty of small load tactics. What it is. It looks like a booze cruise because it's the guys that would do the booze cruise.
All right, just curious. All right, thanks for that, Jared. And last item here. Just a reminder, guys, we've relaunched this Forward Observer website. We're running on a new website now. We're posting all of our reporting, also updates throughout the day over on the watch floor. Plus, we're building a handful of open source intelligence tools to keep everyone connected to the risk of domestic conflict, the risk of international conflict, a handful of other things. Head over to forwardobserver.com. You can start a free 7-day trial at forwardobserver.com and check us out. If you don't like it, most people do, but if you don't, just hit cancel. If you get billed on day 7.5, email me. If you want a refund, I'll give you a refund. And we certainly would appreciate your support. Also, as a reminder, on Tuesday, September 2nd, we're going to be briefing the Sitrep items on all major platforms and then taking our early warning items behind the paywall for members only. So we certainly would appreciate your support. With that, Jared, I think we do have some questions over on the Forward Observer High Side chat.
We sure do. From Bad Wabbit, isn't it standard practice in the Middle East also, speaking of oil theft?
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is oil theft over there. There's a lot of graft and corruption, obviously. I don't know. Someone also in the comments said Africa is really bad for oil theft. I'm only familiar with oil theft in Mexico. Frankly, I forget. They even have a name for these guys. Forget exactly what it is, but that's all they do. It's just organized oil theft rings, and they're obviously operating here in the United States. Next question.
All right. Also from Bad Wabbit, how do you think the ESG will play out? Will they ignore it, capitulate? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I recall correctly, I mean it's fairly unpopular. Robert, how do you think this ESG push is going to play out? It's your item. Earlier last year, we saw a lot of these ESG efforts being defeated and rolled back because they were so unpopular. Obviously, there's still a push, and let's be honest. This is, they say it's for economic justice and it's for a progressive society and et cetera, et cetera. Really, it's about control. But how do you see this playing out?
Well, that's a really good point because I think it came out last year or became more well known that the origins of ESG actually started with a UN official in a published paper from a few years ago that said it basically outlined it's explicitly political. So the decarbonization push is about really control, like you said. As far as how it plays out, there's been an active effort from this group that has existed for a long time called Consumers Research. They've been fighting a lot of these legal battles and a lot of the PR battles. They've been pretty media savvy as far as calling out the ESG push from BlackRock and State Street. So far, they've been fairly successful, and I think they have been turning some of these companies that BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, their assets they're managing. Like I remember reported on last year, I think it was American Airlines actually sued BlackRock over how they were using their proxy votes to push ESG. Right now, it looks to be succeeding, and there's still more than 3 years left in the Trump administration, so there's still a lot of time for the Trump administration and these groups like Consumers Research to submit this pushback against ESG.
Mm-hmm. You know, I remember several years ago when this ESG stuff first got started. I think it was a Moody's report basically saying that eventually under ESG, like if you get a stock prospectus, okay, which is like a little booklet on all the company information and the stock information, eventually right next to the profit and loss line is going to be an ESG score. And they're basically saying investors are going to increasingly consider an ESG score, not just the company's profits and loss when it comes to investing. Pretty unpopular.
Well, a big part of this, of how they were doing this, was Larry Fink was, normally these big asset managers will put out these annual letters basically to investors. Well, Larry Fink was putting out a letter to CEOs and allegedly was using illegal pressure on these CEOs to implement these decarbonization policies, especially at oil companies. And that seems to really be the crux of a lot of these successful lawsuits and pushback against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, by the way, Larry Fink, the CEO over at BlackRock, was but last week appointed as the interim co-chair of the World Economic Forum since Klaus Schwab is out the door. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Next question, Jared.
All right. Next question is from regular veteran. He asks, what happens in Taiwan if China accidentally sparks something at the Sierra Madre?
My understanding is that's Sierra Madre is Philippines versus China, correct?
Yes. The heart of that question gets to why I think nothing is going to escalate here is China can't afford that. If you start a war in the South China Sea, you will materially fail to meet your 2027 readiness deadline for Taiwan. And Taiwan is the bigger prize. So I think, given that the Chinese still, as far as I know, have to have an order from on high to actually conduct the most lethal operations, that they're not going to give that order. Unless they can defend themselves, obviously, but they're not going to get the order to attack, because then you sacrifice Taiwan. And keep in mind that would more than likely escalate far beyond a couple of built-up rocks in the South China Sea. Basically, everybody in the coalition would look at that and go, "See, I told you they're aggressive," and get in on it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, it seems like it would be bad publicity for China, considering all the coalition members there. All right, thanks for that, Jared. We do have a couple of questions here about the popular support stuff that I'll run through. More than 15 to 30% of people voted against Trump. Why is there not an insurgency now, or is there? Well, no, there is not an insurgency. And remember, when we're talking about popular support, there's support for the cause, and then there's also support for tactics. And one of the things that we saw during Occupy Wall Street, I think we also saw this after the BLM riots, is support for the cause was sustained. Support for the tactics decreased substantially. No one wants to be disrupted. Americans actually dislike political violence. We don't want to see it. We don't want to see it in the streets. We don't want to see people being gunned down. And so that's just a pretty unpopular thing. So why is there not support for an insurgency? Well, because very few actually want to see that, number one. And, you have to maintain support for your cause. And just historically in America, Americans eventually turn very hard against violence. I did this whole write-up from the past, looking at violent movements versus nonviolent movements in the past 100 years in this country. And it's pretty astounding how quickly Americans' opinions turn against violence and violent social movements specifically. So I would say there's not an insurgency now because the left does not want to pursue an armed insurgency. Not something they want to do. Insurgency on average lasts 10 years. No one wants to do this for 10 years. Color revolutions, on the other hand, can be built up in many cases beneath the threshold of what's observable. But once they build that momentum, once they actually launch a color revolution in earnest, it can be very quick, like 2 to 4 weeks. And we're talking about weeks to months, not years. And so they're not pursuing an armed revolution or an armed insurgency strategy. They're pursuing one of strategic non-cooperation using nonviolent tactics. There is going to be violence, of course, but this is going to be predominantly nonviolent when it does happen. And again, there's support for nonviolence. There's not a lot of support for violence. And listen, I think you have to be very careful with what you see on social media, people saying they support violence. You know, it's funny. I just watched this video yesterday of some left-wing guy, and he said, oh, look, here's an ICE agent. Here's what his name is, and his wife is a nurse at some place. And, if you see this guy, it's always, hey, someone else go exercise violence, but I'm not going to do it myself. So even though there are calls for violence, you just have to understand, of course, there's going to be some violence, but the people calling for violence they don't have the balls to go commit it themselves. And I think that's just a distinction. That's just a reality that you have to recognize. Good question. How does popular support insurgency theory mesh with the 3 phases and the 3.5% theory? Well, remember, as a movement, you not only have to maintain popular support for your cause, but also for your tactics. People have to support that level of escalation. So if the support to move from protest to resistance is not there, you're going to be very difficult to sustain that. If support for whatever escalation you want is not there, it's just you're going to have problems maintaining support while you do that. And the last thing you want to do is harm your own legitimacy. And so people have to look at that and say, are protests legitimate? And most Americans say, yeah, protest in whatever form is legitimate. Is political violence legitimate? I see a lot of Americans saying, eventually, I think political violence is going to be needed. There was that poll from a couple of years ago, and I think like 30 or 50% or something like that of Americans said they think political violence is going to be required to solve this country's problems. That concept is obviously in the zeitgeist, but I don't think right now Americans would say like armed, organized political violence is legitimate. So in terms of how that popular support goes for the 3 phases, in order to advance to the next phase, you've got to have popular support for the tactics, for that level of escalation. If it's not there, probably not going to happen. And then that 3.5% theory says you got to get 3.5% of a country involved in organized resistance. And if you can do that, historically, they say through like 300 case studies, pretty much no regime has survived that. So that's what they want to build up towards. That No King's Day was like was about 3 million people mobilized. They need 3.5% of America is about 12 million people. So they're maybe 25% of the way there. This is why guys, these people are basically stuck in phase 1. I don't think they have enough support to move to phase 2. They need to continue building. They've only turned out like 3 million people. They need far more than that. I don't think there's a specific number that they need. But, if they had like 5 or 10 million turning out, if Labor Day they had, 5 million people turn out, that would be very significant. I don't think they're going to get 5 million. They may claim 5 million. They tried to claim 5 million. One guy tried to claim a lot of this stuff's inflated because it reinforces their narrative. If you have 100,000 people turning out, that's like small and dinky. No one wants to go join that. But if you're like, oh, this is the largest thing on record, we have 10 million people turn out, then a lot more people are going to be encouraged to get off the sidelines and join the movement. So I also think you have to be careful at taking some of those claims of mobilization, take it with a grain of salt. So they're trying to build support for their cause. That's kind of difficult to do because most Americans, I think, still agree that immigration enforcement needs to happen, even though some Americans don't like how it's being done. I think generally they do like that it is being done. And so this is just a really difficult time for this protest, I just call it the color revolution movement, but they are pretty much stuck. I mean, I think, we track their protests day to day, obviously, and Jared made a chart the other day showing that through the weekday, actually the protest volume has actually been decreasing for the past few months. These past few national days of action have also been way smaller than what we saw back in June. And this is still, it has been still summer, which should be the peak of protest season. And we're seeing total turnout diminish. So they've obviously plateaued, which is something I said in the strategic assessment I published earlier this week. All right, a couple more questions briefly. Do you plan on letting us know when the Civil War is about to start? There's a lot of theories and guesses. And that makes it very easy to be the nothing ever happens type of guy. Well, yeah, I generally agree. Nothing ever happens until it does happen. Listen, one thing you will not see from us is hair on fire, wacky predictions. A lot of the people who say this crazy stuff, they make money off of eyeballs. They have to get attention. They got to get people landing on their website. They got it because they make money from ads. They make money from eyeballs, not from being right. We at Forward Observer, especially through our early warning report, if we say stuff that's wacky, we have massive corporations who get the early warning reports. So we're incentivized to be right because I don't want to hurt our Forward Observer brand. I don't want to be wrong. And so we're incentivized to not make those crazy, wacky predictions. If I feel extremely strong, if I feel strongly about something, I will swing for the fences. Like last year when I told you no one was going to riot over there wouldn't be a 2020 2.0 this year, that we weren't going to have mass riots over the election. We weren't going to have mass riots over the inauguration. I swung for the fences on that because I was very sure that was not going to happen. But yes, if I see, eventually we will get to some escalation, and we will see some escalation, I think, in political violence. And to the best of my ability, I will tell you before that happens. That's going to be on the early warning side. This is going to be for Forward Observer or early warning members predominantly. So thanks for that. But yeah, of course, my duty is to warn. My duty is to look at the trends, to look at these early warning indicators, look at how these indicators are stacking up. Like, let's just say you have 20 indicators you're watching, okay? And when you see 5 of those indicators exhibited out of 20, it's a pretty low level. Probably not going to see anything pop off. When you start moving to 10, 12, 15, 17 out of 20, you're getting much closer to all the things that have to happen before that escalation. And yes, we track these every day. I will tell you when we get close. That is another benefit of being a Forward Observer subscriber. Head over to forwardobserver.com, start a free 7-day trial, and stay up to date on all this stuff. A couple other questions here. Is right-wing community are right-wing community organizers less successful due to atomization, and left-wing organizers more successful due to working in communities with strong in-group preference? Yeah, I think just fundamentally, there is a difference between how the right and left view organization. And I've seen the thing that people say, oh, the conservatives or the right wing tend to be more individualist. The left tends to be more collectivist. So they have a predisposition towards organizing. And there's obviously some truth to that. The biggest thing is, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily individualist versus collectivist. Near as I can tell, it is about submission. I think conservatives are far conservative men, and I'd say this, maybe my own experience is clouded, but my submission predominantly is either to God or my family. And I'm not I'm not interested in submitting to anyone else unless it's for just a really good cause. And I think on the right and for conservatives, I think you see a lot more of that. On the left, however, these people, I think they are willing to submit themselves to an organization. And so when you look at the power, basically any organization has internal power and external power. And their internal power comes from conditioning. Okay, conditioning is the method by which you get people to submit to the cause. And I think that's just a lot stronger on the left. When you have that conditioning program, when you condition belief, you're basically creating belief in people. And of course, this happens on the right too. Everyone gets conditioned. Everyone's marketed to. All sorts of people, corporations, governments, law enforcement, social groups, everybody is trying to condition belief in you. I'm trying to condition belief in you. I want you to believe in our mission. I want you to believe in Forward Observer that we do this professionally all week long. And we're looking at these indicators and we're looking at stuff. We're reporting on stuff that you're not going to see anywhere else. I'm giving you inside perspective, especially about domestic conflict, that no one else is providing. So you're always being marketed and sold to. But when we talk about organizations, there's that internal conditioning, which creates internal power. That's the balled up fist. The more socially cohesive a group is, the more external power it's going to be able to wield. And I just think that is far more prevalent in left-wing organizations than in right-wing organizations. Honestly, I think the best instance of right-wing organizing is probably through the church. I think that is probably a source. Submission to God is probably a source of right-wing power. Certainly more prevalent on the right than the left. And I think that's one reason why the left has tried to really disintegrate the church. I think the church has been targeted. And so, I look at the church as a probably the largest institutional source of right-wing power. And so if you're on the left, you obviously want to disintegrate people, not disintegrate into bits, but disintegrate them from that source of power to make them less powerful. I think that's what's going on. In a long-winded way, I hope that answers your question, Mr. Twinkle Balls. All right. If Ireland and the UK get a little more hot with civil war, which side would the U.S. side with, government or legacy citizens? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that we're looking at like a Spanish Civil War scenario where they have international brigades, like Americans going to fight with Ukraine. Maybe they do. I'm not sure. I think this is it's obviously part of a much larger kind of global conflict between more conservative or nativist or nationalist elements and the internationalist and immigrant elements. If the U.S. sides with either side, it's probably going to largely depend on who's running the administration. All right, Clark says, these morning reports have really grounded me and given great context. Well, Clark, I appreciate that. That is why we exist, to put the world and put the country, especially the future of the world and the country, in context, helping people understand what we're looking at in the future so that you can be better prepared, so you can make decisions. That's our mission, to move you forward with early warning. And that's our company's mission here at Forward Observer as well. ForwardObserver.com. Go join us. Join our mission. Help us advance our mission that I just talked about. We appreciate your support. Everyone have a great rest of your Friday and also a great weekend. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back in your inbox on Monday morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.